Live. Welcome to this breakout about the Nexus Challenge. My name is Suzanne, and I'm giving the floor to our moderator, Dr. Nonay, and enjoy the session.
Thank you
I
very
will be
much.
here in the background.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And on behalf of the panel and our keynote speaker, welcome to everybody. We're really pleased to welcome you today to this session about driving system change, corporate leadership for the SDGs, and looking at the Nexus challenge. I think we can really call it a challenge because this is something, as our keynote speaker will say, that requires a mindset and process transformation. Without further ado, I'm happy to welcome, well, first let me mention everybody, but Måns Nilsson, who is the Executive Director of Stockholm Environment Institute and has been working really hard on his team to provide very useful tools for all of us to connect the dots, and he will explain how with the SDGs and how to create transformations. To put it in a very simplistic way, to accelerate that transition for sustainable development. Jan Anton van Zanten will follow. Jan Anton is SDG strategist at Robeco, and he's also a co-author of Enhancing Corporate Contribution to Sustainable Development, a Nexus approach. So again, you know, connecting the dots to the SDGs with Rob van Tolder. And we are really lucky to have the contribution of Moritz Groen, Piet Klopp, Matthias Lund-Larsen, and Lisa Sachs for our panel discussion. So Moritz will bring the entrepreneurial aspect of transforming businesses and corporation for sustainability. Moritz Groen is called and introduced as a serial social entrepreneur, and will bring perspective about the role of entrepreneurship and social innovation and impact investment. Piet Klopp is the head of responsible investment, working on affordable and sustainable pension funds, and will bring this perspective. Matthias Lund-Larsen is senior researcher, consultant at International Institute of Green Finance, and also a PhD fellow about green finance in China. So we welcome his perspective and also his perspective on the other on the Chinese perspective. And Lisa Sachs is the director of Columbia Center of Sustainable Investment. Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment is a joint center of Columbia Law School and the Earth Institute, and we're very lucky to have you and see how well a sustainable investment over developing and helping accelerate that transition. So Måns, we will start with you and your presentation, and then it will be followed by Jan. Thank you, Måns.
Well, thank you very much. I will maybe start by saying I wouldn't necessarily say it's simplistic. We're trying to take a very complex material and turn it into something that is tractable and useful for policy and planning and strategy. So you might call it simplexity, simple attribution of complexity. Do you see the presentation now?
Yes, we do.
So
thank you.
A good starting point could be to just say a few words about the SDGs and the origin. And I'd like to start by showing this quote from the preamble of the 2030 Agenda, which talks about the interlinkages and integrated nature of the SDGs, and that we're looking for the lives of all to be profoundly improved and the world will be transformed. So for us, it's been the starting point, these three key principles: universality, it's for all, transformation, and interlinkages. And today we're going to be focusing on the interlinkages and the integrated aspect of the SDGs and what that means for business, of course. So there are certain reasons why we want to focus on this. And in our work, we have talked about SDG interactions as the basis for better decision making. SDG interactions can help you to understand how your set of priorities are relating to other priorities, whether in a policy setting or in a business strategy, for example. So it helps you to understand who can you cooperate with, where do you have joint objectives or joint objectives, and who do you need to negotiate with, where do you see trade-offs and conflicts that need to be resolved. Secondly, it can help you set priorities for investment, where you get the most impact and the best knock-on effects. By improving one goal, you can get effects also on other goals. And not the least, in our siloed world, we can find ways to talk about interactions that help us develop effective dialogue and learning processes. So what we did was to sketch out a very simple scale of interactions that was published already back in 2016 based on the SDGs, ranging from the most negative, a cancelling interaction, where you do one thing, makes it impossible to reach another thing, through constraining, consistent, enabling, reinforcing, and up to the most positive interaction, indivisible, like when you do one thing, you automatically get another. And we can talk about a lot of examples here, but we don't have so much time. But for example, an example of a indivisible interaction would be if we make progress on women's education in poor countries, we automatically get improvements in maternal health outcomes. They go hand in hand with education. A enabling interaction could be, for example, if we provide energy, better electricity access in villages, we will enable better school outcomes because students can do homework and they can do their studies in the dark when they have light. Doesn't mean that it automatically happens, because students might instead choose to, for example, grab beers or something, but they have the conditions in place to do it. And on the constraining side, of course, a lot of the environmental versus economic outcomes exist. So what we do with this then is to create a kind of a pairwise discussion around these targets. How does progress on one target influence progress on another? So, for example, in the case of Sweden, we can see that strengthening water resources management can be a constraining factor on renewable energy, because a lot of our renewable energy comes from hydropower. And hydropower is heavily regulated in terms of how it can be run from a water resources and environmental perspective. Same time, improved water resources management, strengthening that, can have a reinforcing effect on marine pollution, which has to do with improved cleaning of like the river and the runoff into the Baltic Sea, which is a major problem in our region. So doing this for all the targets becomes a very big matrix. And what we usually do is to build a kind of a simplified matrix where we test all the combinations from a selection of goals. This was the first test we did back in 2017, where we picked 34 goals and put them against each other and found out how the interaction matrix looks for the case of Sweden. From then, we have started to now build a more systematic tool that can be used by anyone, which is now being made available online, where you sort of take your decision context and carry out these progress discussions. If we make progress on one target, how does it influence progress on another target? And then you go to this so-called SDG Synergies approach, and it's available on sdgsynergies.org, a sort of system for doing this, which contains basically 3 steps. A design stage where you set the overall parameters for this, how it should be done, what targets do you want to look at, and who should be involved in the scoring and the discussion. The second stage is the actual interaction scoring, which can be done by experts or different stakeholder groups. It's a kind of a workshop-driven process, and this tool online is then available to sort of organize and record the results. So you get the pairs of targets scored on the 7-point scale and reflecting how they potentially support or hinder each other. And then there is an analytical stage, which involves different types of visualization and analysis of the patterns that emerge from the scoring. And we can do different types of networks or matrix, kind of cross-impact matrix analysis to demonstrate where do we have the best bang for the buck in terms of investment, where do we have negative that we need to watch out for, etc., etc. And with this as a basis, we can start to talk about in a policy setting or in a city environment, for example, but also taking this to the level of business and investment is the next step of what we're trying to do. It's a bit of a complicated, or it's quite burdensome to develop these matrices. So when we now take the next step in terms of business, we try to automate certain parts of the process. And in our current development project, which is called the SDG Compass, we're working to pre-develop a number of these historical contexts, how a sort of SDG interaction looks in a certain country, so that the people that are interested in testing their strategies do not get stuck on that first step. So we have done a lot of expert panels and crowdsourcing and statistical data correlations to establish what we call the context maps. And from then, the actual work now comes into the strategy analysis, where business or a sector or an individual company can test how their strategy not only affects a range of SDGs, but how it actually affects the interaction between the SDGs. So it's sort of the next derivative to understand the systemic effect, not only the linear effect of a certain strategic choice or investment or option. So this is still not available for public consumption, but the first part that I discussed is available, and you can have a look yourself and also register. The tool is available if you get in touch with us, but it will also be set up as an online, immediately available tool for anybody to test on this website called sdgsynergies.org. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Måns. Maybe you can share the website, yes, in the chat, so that people can visit and ask questions. Next, we will have Jan Anton bringing a perspective from Robeco. But I think as a follow-up question, and we can see also with the panel, it would be, and what's next, and how then do a business, transform, and how can they make the best use of integrating this work that you have done, in their strategy to accelerate the transformation for sustainability. And that would be a very, at least from a personal concern, interesting question to discuss. So Jan, if you're ready to go, I see that your slides are shared. I can mute myself. Welcome, Jan.
Ready. We only have 10 years left to achieve the SDGs, so let's go. So good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be with you. And thanks so much, Mons, for this introduction on the interconnections between the SDGs. Now, I think what's truly important about what you're highlighting is that the SDGs are not 17 isolated goals, but of course we should see them as an interconnected parts, right? So we need to think about how to operationalize these interactions, and companies should do the same thing. So let me try to tie this back to the role of companies, also as inputs for the further discussion among this panel. So of course, when the SDGs were adopted by the world's leaders back in 2015, they explicitly called upon the private sector to also drive contributions. I think this is for a very good reason, because companies, of course, have positive impacts that can help achieve the SDGs. Companies might provide goods and services that help people meet their most basic needs, like access to healthcare, water and sanitation, or renewable energy. But companies oftentimes also have negative impacts that deteriorate progress. Think about corruption, bribery, or environmental pollution. So what we need to do, I think, is we need to better understand these impacts, simply because companies have such major impacts on the SDGs, this makes them really decisive in achieving the SDG agenda. Now, the good news really is that companies have embraced the SDG agenda, but then the bad news is that they don't really seem to be too good at integrating the SDGs into their core strategy. So just to give you a couple of figures, what we see is that more than 70% of companies now report on companies, but only a quarter of them integrate them into their core strategy. We also see that companies are very happy to report on their positive impacts on the goals, but they are not so happy to talk and assess their negative impacts. And for these reasons, it's really not surprising that only a very small portion of CEOs around the world is feeling that companies are effectively contributing to the SDGs. I think that also leads to a good question for this panel of experts is how can we actually help companies create strategies that effectively advance the SDGs? Now, I've been asked to give both a practitioner perspective on this question and a research perspective. So in my day-to-day job, I work as an SDG strategist at Robeco, an asset management firm headquartered in Rotterdam with a very long history of sustainable investing. And we also integrate the SDGs into our investment strategies. So what we need to do in order to integrate the SDGs into our investment strategies is we need to have a good understanding of what the positive and the negative impacts are of companies on the SDGs. And we do that by analyzing companies and their impacts through a three-step process. So let me just guide you through it, because I think that might help think further about the impacts of companies on the SDGs. So in the first step of our SDG framework, when we analyze companies, we really ask what the impact is of the products and services that companies provide on each of the SDGs. So positive contribution might stem from providing medicine or water and sanitation, insurance for natural catastrophes, and so forth. Those are clear areas in which companies can provide positive contributions. But of course, we also have many companies providing products and services that have negative impacts. Think about fossil fuels, fast food, gambling, and so forth. So this is what we analyze in the first step of the SDG framework. Then in the second step, we move to operations. All companies operate, and here, through their operations, they might also impact additional SDGs. Think about the governance of a company, think about gender equality, performance, environmental management. These are all the things that we then take into account in the second step of the SDG framework. And finally, in the third step, we look at controversies. So it might be that you have a company that's producing fantastic services for the SDGs in the first step. That company might also have good operations in place, but that company might then still be engaged in a controversy. Think about an environmental disaster, think about a fraud case or corruption. And of course, we don't want that from an SDG perspective. So that's what we then take into account in this final step. Now, what comes out of this assessment is an SDG score that gives an indication of the magnitude of a company's positive or negative impacts on the SDGs. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, this score is ranging from very negative, a -3 score, to very positive, a +3 score. And with those scores, we can invest in companies that make positive contributions, and we can divest or not invest in companies that negatively contribute to the SDG agenda. We have been doing this for the past 3 years or so. We're seeing that these strategies are gaining a lot of traction in the market. This also gives us a lot of insight, for instance, on engaging with individual companies on improving further SDG impacts. So we see that, looking at companies' impacts from an SDG lens is actually good for our investment strategies. So then I was also asked to contribute from a research perspective on what is really needed to improve companies' impacts on the SDGs. So next to my work, I've been writing my PhD dissertation on the role of companies in achieving the SDGs. A number of publications really build on the work of Mons Nielsen on the interconnections between the SDGs and how we can operationalize that in a Nexus perspective, and how companies might manage their positive and negative interactions on the SDGs. So this is all being summarized in the conference paper that we wrote together with Rob van Tulder. We will share the link with you as well. So in this publication, we really look into what is the impact of companies on the SDGs. What does that mean for corporate strategies? So if companies want to improve their impacts on the SDGs, what might they need to do? And how can companies then take these direct and indirect interactions with the SDGs into account, which may be positive and negative, in order to try to advance multiple SDGs at the same time, while avoiding the risk that positive contributions to one SDG come at trade-off for others. So that's what we're trying to do here. But to close this very brief presentation, I just want to also put 5 sort of key questions for further enhancing corporate contributions to the SDGs, also for this panel, because I think these are really 5 critical steps that we need to tackle in order to go into this decade of action. Now, the first is really on impact. How can we better measure companies' positive and negative impacts? So what's needed for that? The second is all on the Nexus principle. So how can we not only look at companies' direct positive and negative impacts on SDGs, but how can we then also better understand, for instance, by building on the work of Mons Nielsen, how can we then better understand how positive or negative contributions have knock-on effects on other SDGs? A third point is around data. So what are the big data gaps? How do we look at those throughout supply chains, across geographies, and so forth, to really understand how we might measure and manage impacts? Then fourth, on partnerships. We already heard it in the previous sessions. Companies can't do it alone. They have big impacts, but they probably need to work together with governments, civil society organizations, universities, and their value chain partners. So how can we really operationalize that? And then finally, also from a systems perspective, companies are being regulated, and regulation could support, but that might also limit corporate contributions to the SDGs. So to really move forward, I think these are 5 key aspects that I would also love to get some ideas on from this panel and to discuss further.
Thank you, Jan, and for sharing and your research and your the work that you've done in advancing sustainable investment. So now we will open the floor to the panel and also all the wonderful people listening to you. So please share your questions in the chat, and so that I can convey it. So we have this opportunity now to have a conversations between researchers and also social entrepreneur, also get the perspective from health and well-being, pension, and also from the green finance and sustainable investment. And I think there are various questions that have been shared now. Maybe we could start with the use of creating interlink and the use of helping organization connect the dots, and from different perspective, an entrepreneurial perspective, maybe a law and investment perspective. How would you see that happen, with the stakeholders that you are dealing with? And Moritz, I have to warn you that you're sharing your screen now. And just a technical glitch. How would you see that happen from your perspective, from your expertise, this helping organization connect with between the different SDGs and the different stakeholder and multi-stakeholder, as Rob likes to often call it that way. I would like to open the floor first to the people who have not, the panelists who have not spoken. So maybe Lisa, Pete, and Moritz and Matthias, you're welcome. Lisa?
Thank you. I'd love to jump in. Thanks so much for those incredibly interesting presentations, and had the chance to read the papers before. I wish we had hours to discuss and engage because there was so much. But I thought I would just be provocative, take the opportunity to make 2 points that relate to the paper I also co-wrote for this for Rob's special issue. One is the note on, it's great to see the breakdown from Rebecca of looking at product and process. To that, I would add 2 other aspects of business activity that I think are absolutely critical to look at. One is the understanding of the value chains and to what extent companies' responsibility or share responsibility for sustainability challenges and impacts throughout their value chains. We've done a deep analysis, for instance, at our center on the coffee supply chain. And one thing that becomes clear is that it's not enough for coffee roasters to manage the impacts in their own productions and even in their own supply chains, because the challenges are really displaced throughout value chains. So that is one I would add. A final one that I would add that is a big bucket, but a really important one in my view, is the way in which companies engage with society, what we call corporate citizenship, for lack of a better word, which is the extent to which companies are engaging in lawmaking policies, formal and informal lawmaking processes, tax practices, responsible engagement with litigation, both offensively and defensively. So there are a number, and to my mind, these are really critical ways in which companies impact on the SDGs. To use one example that I use all the time is Coca-Cola, which does quite well in sustainability ratings. They were introduced at an event I went to as one of the largest sustainability organizations. I would hope and suspect that the product they produce and the fact that it's contributes to the largest health crisis on our planet of malnutrition, undernutrition, and obesity would be captured by Rebecca's product line, but they are embedded in policymaking processes around the world to challenge any type of regulation that might regulate the sector. So that's one point I would make. The second point I want to make, to be a bit provocative, about, well, at the adoption of the SDGs at my center, we did a mapping of the SDGs for the mining sector, where we went SDG by SDG and activity by activity to look at impact. And in the end, while I'm glad that it opened the conversation, I think it was really the wrong approach. It allowed for cherry picking of SDGs. It allowed for, it allowed the SDGs to be used more as a communications strategy and more, as a way to explain what they were already doing and where the contributions are. And it failed to see the role that this sector plays in the SDG transformations and what that implies from a sector perspective. I think what we've seen over the past 5 years is a proliferation of sustainability reporting from companies, an exponential proliferation of ESG investing. And all of this has corresponded with a worsening of SDG outcomes, most of which are because of our ever-expanding economy on a finite planet and our inability to manage those impacts. So I don't think that we yet have the frameworks and the tools that are fit for purpose. And I just wanted to put that out there, having also worked on really the mapping of the sector and looking at impacts and positive and negative impacts. I just worry that that takes it too micro in a way that we are going to continue to be on this track of minute matching and missing the big picture as the outcomes continue to worsen. So my provocative remarks, and look forward to discussion.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. That's very necessary. And my personal provocative comment was, where are the planetary boundaries? So I'm very grateful for your comments about the fact that we live on a finite planet. And where is the urgency to remain below 1.5 degree increase and the direct actions. So I'm happy to hear this conversation continue, and maybe we can take it from a social entrepreneurship perspective, if this is okay. Matthias, would you be comfortable continuing, maybe bringing the perspective of the role of entrepreneurship, and what do you see as necessary in our next step to make sure that we really accelerate the transition for sustainability?
Well, I mean, I work on China, and it's mostly a regulatory issue there. So I don't think the entrepreneurial perspective should be brought by me, in fact.
Oh, I'm
Maurits has excellent
I'm completely
ideas.
sorry.
Exactly,
Yes.
that
Maurits,
would be more
yes.
suitable.
I'm very sorry. Yeah.
Well, yeah, entrepreneurial aspect. I'm often announced as a sustainability entrepreneur, which I think is a contradiction in terms, or a pleonasm actually. It's annoying because I think when an entrepreneur is not sustainable, we as society should not allow them to operate, because that will always consequently be at the detriment of society. So that's to start with. And we've been talking about SDGs, and Lisa mentioned the cherry picking by companies, because they feel, of course, the pressure from society to actually finally do something about the huge problems that we've been creating as a global society. And then they point out to the good things that they do, and they cherry pick indeed 1 or 2 or 3 of the SDGs, and then try to get away with that. So I think we should be very careful that we don't allow companies to do that, to get away with just presenting things that they did already, or that are hardly to the core of their company. Actually, I became an entrepreneur some 15 years ago, after some 30 years of consulting and communicating about sustainability, consulting in companies, governments, and NGOs, trying to help them formulate their environmental policies and communicate about them. And I thought that the problem was getting out of hand very quickly and drastically. And I thought, well, maybe the better way to communicate about what should be done is show that it can be done, and actually contribute already something to solving the problem. So I've been setting up a number of companies over the last 15 years. The time frame to explain a little bit about that is too short, actually, of course, with the few minutes that we have here. But underlying all those companies is not trying to make something a little bit better, but trying to take 2 or 3 or 4 steps back, and then try to formulate for yourself on critical issues, food, energy, health, education, etc., what actually would be good, and to work from there and try to reformulate an industry, and then try to come up with a solution. And then, of course, you have to implement that. One example that I can make, I can't go into detail in others, is a company I founded a number of years ago called Kipster. And Kipster resembles a bit hipster. It's a funny name, even in Dutch, because kip in Dutch is chicken, and ster is star. So it's a bit playing with the name. But we try to reinvent the poultry business, because we don't have time to convert everybody on the planet to become a vegetarian before the planet has gone bust ecologically. So try to be very pragmatic. I'm a vegetarian myself, and 3 of the 4 founders of this company also are vegetarians, but we are chicken farmers now, because chicken are very useful animals, because they eat waste that we otherwise would throw away, and they convert that into high nutritious protein, which has been done all around the world, is very cruel to the animals. And effectively what we do, we cut down the Amazon rainforest, grow soybeans there, ship them over the ocean, give them to the animals, slaughter the animals, or have them in quite unfavorable circumstances. We, in the Netherlands, for example, we accumulate a lot of shit. Actually, we have 100 million chicken on a population of 17 million. So just imagine. So it's a system that doesn't work. So what we decided to do to completely reverse that industry, not grow one single square meter of land to feed the chicken, but only use waste material from supermarkets, from bakeries, from all around, to give them a good life, not to murder the male chicken, the roosters on day one, which is regular business, even in organic farming. Supply all the power that we need on the roof with solar panels. What completely rethink the whole industry and make it energy positive instead of putting CO2, methane, etc. out in the atmosphere, which of course will limit in the end the number of chicken around the world, because we eat way too much animal protein. It's not healthy for us. And the same thing we've been doing with the energy sector, bringing solar power to Africa, but also super efficient cook stoves, reversing the economy with for example, African and Indian countries, because they produce things that normally are being put onto the market in the normal chains.
Moritz, I'm sorry, but I will have to invite you to share, if you can, links in the web in the chat so that our participants can read more, because all the case studies that you're mentioning are super inspirational. But we have only 8 minutes left for sake of hearing Pete also and Matthias and closing the session.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to inspire these very inspiring stories, but as everybody can hear, this is entrepreneurship, this is social entrepreneurship and sustainable entrepreneurship. And I think all social entrepreneurs and social impact investors have a lot of wonderful and inspiring, innovative stories to share with us that are solving grand challenges at a more micro level. So thank you very much for sharing that. I would like to so please, Moritz, share more in the chat and about the other companies that you mentioned. I would like to invite Matthias, and sorry for my mistake. I mistaken maybe two
No
ends
stress.
was too much, to give us a perspective maybe about, it's up to you, maybe about transparency and
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thanks for the presentations, both to Monson and Anton. I think it's very interesting to see these tools and these visualizations of the interactions between the SDGs. That's very useful for people to see. So allow me to, as I work in a Chinese organization, a Chinese think tank, to see this from a Chinese perspective, give some insights on that. A few observations. The first is that SDG strategizing through this comprehensive Nexus approach is absolutely needed and very important in China. Chinese companies generally perform lower on ESG scores than other companies, so they obviously need to do better. The SDG finance gap is the largest in China, and therefore we could say that the marginal benefit of changing corporate behavior in China would be larger than doing it elsewhere. So it's absolutely important in China. A second observation is that there's actually not that much tailoring needed to be done in terms of the interactions between the SDGs in China. So despite China's unique circumstances, the visualization that Jan Anton showed, and we've seen the conference papers, would actually look very much the same in China. So though that is the same, the approach to the SDGs in China is very different. The state puts the framework around the economy that the companies then act inside. It's state-driven, top-down, regulation-centered approach to aligning behavior with the SDGs. So when Chinese policies and certain industries come out, they'll mention sustainable development, they might mention the SDGs, but they'll never say which target. So there's a poverty alleviation campaign that doesn't mention the SDG goal at poverty, but just that poverty is important. So the state puts out many regulations and standards defining the direction that companies go in without referring specifically back to the SDGs. So there's a translation process literally and conceptually from the SDG framework globally into the policies and the regulation and standards that the Chinese states puts around the economy that then directs the companies to go in the right direction. And they often do go in the right direction, but there are many mismatches as well in China. I think the first one is that despite the rhetoric in China that economic productivity is aligned with environmental sustainability, we don't always see that in practice. For example, the Chinese economic stimulus package this year focused on the old drivers of growth, real estate, heavy industry, infrastructure. That led to a record number of coal plants being built in China in a time where we're supposed to be reducing emissions. So in practice, there's clearly an inconsistency between the SDG targets on economic growth and then with the one on climate and environmental sustainability in China. That's one mismatch. Another interesting example is specifically on coal, what they in China call clean coal, a mismatch between the objective of reducing air pollution and climate issues. So clean coal it's a technology that reduces pollutants into the air. It's very effective for reducing air pollution, but completely useless in terms of climate change. Chinese green finance and green economic standards include clean coal because they focus on one and not the other at the same time. So just to finish this off, while we still have time for Pete to say a few words. So in summary, the Nexus approach is very useful in China for business managers, but also for the government to understand relations between SDGs when they set standards and regulate the economy. So I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Pete, I would very much like to welcome your perspective. Yes.
Brief here. As much as I like the Nexus concept, I'm afraid it isn't quite the way that we progressed in developing our interest on the SDGs. I'm working with a big Dutch pension fund, and our game traditionally has been big and boring. We really learn to care about impact. And the different initiatives that I've been involved in really try to standardize our thinking and our actual impacts of our investments according to the SDGs. Now, standardization may be at some, there's some tension between standardization, I think, and the Nexus concept, right? Standardization appeals to the deep desire of investors to make, and we need it because we constantly compare different investment proposals. So comparison is what we like. That is different from the sort of holistic thinking that we need. And yet I think it's perhaps defensible that we've gone this way because we needed to develop that interest first. The theory of change here is that we would want to move from positive impact, and indeed we've been guilty of cherry picking positive impact. On we go to hopefully net impact, hopefully more holistic notions of impact. But we're not there yet. And we felt we couldn't start with the Nexus concept because, it will be so hard to get mainstream institutional investors to buy into this, right? If we start with the most complex stuff, they'll be just scared away and they won't necessarily get engaged at all. So it's a second best thing, I fully admit. But we started with simple notions around the impact. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you. I can imagine the first and especially Mons, I'm very sure you would like to follow up on several points that have been made. Do you want to close the session, Mons, with a few words? I mean, key words that I took were looking at the value chain, having a holistic, but at the same time, very macro and micro, the role of entrepreneurship, so yes, those are my key points. Mons, I happily leave the floor to you to close.
Okay, thank you. It's been quite interesting to listen to the different perspectives here, and I really appreciated getting to know better the work there in Colombia with Lisa, and also the other connections here. The tricky thing, as Pete points out, is to keep it relatively simple so that it can be easily picked up and useful and interpreted by people that don't do this all day, every day. But they have a lot on their mind, such as making a profit. And I think I've been struggling with that a lot, and we're trying to build tools that sort of become almost oversimple. And I think we need to move in that direction from the SDGs. It's very often that, and from the academic point of view, we build these flowcharts and these matrices and concepts and guidelines and so on that become immediately overwhelming. And we really need to nurture this intuitive, basic understanding, almost more about the principles of the SDGs that I started talking about, rather than the individual targets and 169 targets and 300 something indicators that often get the most attention in the reporting and the UN system. When we move to the investor side and the business side, we need to think in a different way. But I think then we have a lot to gain from thinking about universality and transformation and integration in a more principled way, as this is sort of the DNA of the whole thing, but without getting bogged down into technical indicator detail, which people like Jan Anton do not have time for anyway. So I'll stop there and hope we can continue the conversation in follow-up dialogues, as short, a little bit too short meeting time for all of us to get properly involved. But it was very, very nice to meet you all and have this initial conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mons. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jan, Matthias, Lisa, Pete, Moritz. And now Suzanne is inviting us to join the expo booth, I guess. And we'll see each other tomorrow and the day after tomorrow to continue this conversation.